During my time working part-time as a waitress, I unexpectedly encountered my boyfriend at a friend's birthday celebration. It was then that I discovered he hailed from a prosperous family. He had always been judgmental towards me, arguing that roses were pointless and impractical. Yet, on that particular evening, he had ordered 999 roses to honor another woman's birthday. Coincidentally, it was also my birthday. I observed the entire scene quietly and decided to leave without saying anything. Later, I severed all ties by blocking his contact and moved away from the city. That was when he truly lost control. I first met Daniel while juggling a part-time job during college. We both worked at a cafe near the university grounds. The initial moment I saw him, he was dressed in a pristine white shirt, his features sharp and captivating. He resembled the quintessential campus princess from a romance novel, the type who diligently supported himself through his studies. As our acquaintance grew, we exchanged numbers, studied together in the library, and even shared part-time jobs. Thanks to Daniel's striking appearance, everyone at college recognized him as the handsome individual working at the cafe. Students frequently approached him to ask for his number. Initially, he courteously declined, but as the requests increased, he casually pushed me forward, declaring, "She's my girlfriend." I was taken aback and almost denied it, but the earnestness in Daniel's eyes stopped me. Despite my reservations, I didn't contradict him and went along with his declaration. Eventually, Daniel revealed his true feelings, and what began as a facade evolved into a genuine relationship. After we graduated, we rented an apartment and started living together. Being an orphan and coming from a humble background, we both placed immense value on money. City living was expensive, and as new graduates, our financial worth was minimal. On weekends, we took on additional jobs to save for our future wedding. So, when I secured a temporary position as a wedding planner that paid $200 an hour, I was thrilled. However, seeing Daniel, who was supposed to be working extra hours, at that banquet caused my happiness to freeze. Daniel, who was usually thrifty, had abandoned his simple attire for a tailored black suit, his hair neatly swept back to reveal his forehead. He stood tall and composed, exuding an air of untouchability. Without that familiar face, I might not have recognized him. Surrounded by affluent heirs, each vying for his attention, he looked at them with detached indifference, like a deity observing mortals in their pleas. I stood in stunned silence until Nina, my coworker that night, nudged me and asked with concern, "Are you all right?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on Daniel, who seemed worlds away. My voice wavered as I asked, "Who is he?" Nina glanced at him and whispered, "He's the scion of the wealthiest family in the city." I stared at Daniel, now a stranger to me. The boyfriend I'd been with for 4 years, the man without parents who seemed so vulnerable, was actually the heir to a wealthy dynasty. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone and sent him a message. Daniel, lounging with a crowd around him, noticed his phone vibrating. Someone nearby teased him. "Who's that?" He glanced briefly and replied coldly, "Nothing important, just junk." Hearing this felt like plunging into a freezing void. My entire body shook. To Daniel, I was merely insignificant. It all clicked into place. Throughout our 4-year relationship, I had no inkling of his true status. I felt utterly pathetic, as if all my efforts had been futile. The banquet buzzed with energy, but none of it felt relevant to me. I stood there silently, watching the events unfold. A woman in a sophisticated evening gown sat beside Daniel, her proud demeanor and flawless makeup making her resemble a fairy tale princess. Nina placed a massive 5-tiered cake at the center of the room. The sweet aroma of cream and fruit permeated the air even from afar. Guests began presenting their gifts to the woman, with Daniel saving the best for last. He signaled for someone to bring in 999 roses. The woman was so touched that she covered her mouth with her hand, tears brimming in her eyes. The crowd erupted in cheers, and I found myself among a few others dressed in mascot costumes, awkwardly holding the roses. My eyes burned, but no tears came. I couldn't articulate my feelings at that moment. Through the costume, I watched Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. Memories of our first Valentine's Day surfaced. We had gone shopping, and I had begged him to buy me roses when I saw them on the street. He had refused. Once Daniel decided on something, no amount of persuasion could change his mind. What had he said back then? Roses don't symbolize love. They're just a marketing trick to manipulate women. They're not romantic. They're a waste of money, a tax on foolishness. I had been upset. Even though his argument wasn't entirely baseless, I still longed for a bouquet from my boyfriend. When I was pouting, Daniel had picked a piece of wild grass from the park and fashioned it into a simple ring for me. I had been so moved that I cried and even felt guilty for my immaturity. Now, witnessing the scene before me, I only felt foolish. He never actually believed buying roses was wasteful. Perhaps purchasing them for me was the true folly. The banquet was vibrant, but it had nothing to do with me. I quietly completed my duties, collected my paycheck, and left. By the time I returned to our rented apartment, it was nearly midnight. Daniel wasn't home. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the couch. It was my birthday. I had intended to use the money from the wedding planning job to buy myself a cake and a small gift. But on my way back, I felt completely disoriented and went straight home without stopping. Looking around at the familiar furniture and decorations, I thought about how we had built this home together over the years. We had even promised to save up and eventually purchase this place. That promise had kept me working diligently. Even on my birthday, when I secured the $200 an hour job, I couldn't pass it up. After all, what else could I do? If I hadn't attended the banquet, I wouldn't have discovered the truth. But would that have allowed me to continue deceiving myself? I hugged my knees on the couch, unsure how much time had elapsed, before hearing the door open. Daniel returned. He had swapped his luxurious suit for his usual white shirt, reverting to the ordinary man I thought I knew. I stared at him, silent. Daniel changed out of his clothes and approached to embrace me. I pushed him away, noticing the fatigue on his face, and asked, "Why didn't you respond to my message?" Daniel's expression stiffened briefly before softening. "Sorry, I didn't see it. You have no idea how much overtime I've had today," he said with a hint of annoyance. "If I hadn't seen you at that party earlier, enjoying everyone's attention, I might have believed your story." "Do you even remember?" I asked, my voice dry and hoarse. "Today is my birthday. I thought your excuse about working extra hours was genuine, and maybe you'd surprise me afterward. We've been together for 4 years, and for the first 3, you always celebrated my birthday with me, but now it's clear you simply forgot. Or maybe you've just grown tired of me. You forgot your official girlfriend's birthday, but went out of your way to celebrate someone else's with 999 roses. Roses you've never given me." My nose tingled as tears threatened to spill, but I held them back. Daniel had clearly forgotten. He frowned, apologized, and promised to make it up to me the next day with a gift. I didn't respond. He thought I was upset about not receiving a present, so he offered a half-hearted comfort before falling asleep. I didn't throw a fit or say anything. I just watched him, observing his sleeping face. The face I had memorized countless times now felt unfamiliar. We had argued before, even broken up temporarily, but it was always out of frustration. This time was different. "Daniel, this time I'm really done with you." I submitted my resignation letter at work, didn't inform him, and booked a train ticket to City Y. As I left, I took one last look at the city. This was where my dreams with Daniel began. Back then, I was young and naive, believing we could spend our lives together and build a home in this vast city. But in the end, it was just my dream, one I held alone. Now, I was awake. I dragged my suitcase and boarded the train. On the train, I looked at Daniel's contact photo and, against my better judgment, sent him a message. Then, I blocked him on every platform. This act of pretending to be poor ended here. Reality isn't a movie. No one spirals into a multi-year depression over a failed relationship, not even me. Time marches on. I gathered myself, updated my resume, and began job hunting. Since I wasn't a recent graduate, my bachelor's degree didn't offer much of an advantage. Day after day, I immersed myself in a relentless cycle of sending resumes and attending interviews. Thankfully, I had saved a reasonable amount of money during my years with Daniel, hoping we'd use it to build a home together. Even though I was unemployed for a while, I wasn't financially struggling. My busy schedule left little room to dwell on him. Soon, I secured a job and finally settled into a routine. My life became monotonous, commuting between my office and my rented apartment, living quietly on my own. I believed the world was vast enough that, after leaving the city, I'd never cross paths with Daniel again. But fate, or perhaps irony, had other plans. During an interview at my new company, I saw him again. Daniel was seated in the manager's office chair. In just a few months, he had reverted to his true identity, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly, resembling the man I had seen at the party. Of course, he was never genuinely a struggling individual. I handed him the document, pretending not to recognize him, and maintained a professional demeanor. Just as I was about to leave his office, I felt someone grasp my wrist. I looked down at the hand holding me and followed it up to Daniel's face. His expression was blank, but he held on tightly, pulling me closer. I tried to break free, but the strength difference between us made resistance futile. The office was empty. Standing before me, Daniel's face showed no emotion, but I could sense his anger. "Why?" he demanded. His eyes filled with frustration as they met mine. I remained silent, simply staring at him. My expression was a mix of resignation and indifference. Daniel leaned down, looking at me as if I were a petulant cat. "Stop it, okay? I was wrong. Stop it," he said, dismissing everything as if I were the unreasonable one. I laughed bitterly. "Who dares to blame you?" Hearing this, his hand, which had been reaching toward me, froze. Then he placed it on my head as if trying to comfort me. His voice was calm. "Is it really just because of this? Don't be angry anymore, okay? Let's go eat." He brushed the matter aside like it was nothing. No explanation, no apology. "What about the roses?" I insisted, staring at him, hoping for an honest answer. His expression remained calm. "She's just a childhood friend," he said. "You ditched me on my birthday, celebrated hers, and gave her 999 roses. And you call that just a friend?" I retorted. "It's not what you think, Daniel," he replied, his tone steady and detached, as if it didn't concern him. Hearing this, my chest tightened, and tears welled up. "Do you even remember? In all our years together, you've never given me roses, for my birthday or Valentine's Day. For years, I let your words convince me I didn't like roses. But really, who doesn't want their partner to give them flowers on special occasions?" I countered. "You like roses? I'll have them delivered right now," Daniel said earnestly. I looked at him, this man who still didn't understand what he had done wrong. "Maybe I was wrong from the start. You don't love me," I said, shaking off his hand and walking toward the door. As I reached for the handle, his voice came from behind. "Emma, my patience has its limits. I've already explained myself. What more do you want?" I opened the door. "If you walk out of this room, I will try to stop you again," Daniel warned, using our relationship as leverage. "This is the end for us," I declared, stepping through the doorway without hesitation. Looking back, I wondered why I hadn't seen it sooner. Daniel had made it clear many times that he didn't love me. Every time we argued, I was always the first to back down. Maybe my willingness to compromise made him feel invincible. This was the first time Daniel had stooped to apologize to me. He probably didn't believe I'd leave him for good, but he was wrong. At work, I buried myself in tasks, yet trouble found me regardless. My once friendly colleagues began targeting me. Projects were repeatedly rejected and sent back for revisions. I was often singled out to stay late after hours. Conversations among colleagues would halt abruptly when I entered the room. I knew this was all Daniel's doing. After 4 years together, I understood him better than anyone. He seemed indifferent on the surface, but he held grudges. What he once directed at others, he now turned on me. That night, as usual, I was left alone in the office to work overtime. The empty room echoed with silence as my thoughts wandered. I couldn't help but remember how Daniel used to be when we first met. Back then, perhaps it was the novelty, but he was always so gentlemanly. In the early days of our relationship, we often went to the library together. He'd patiently explain assignments to me, and when I got distracted staring at him, he'd tap my head with a pen, his ears turning red as he urged me to focus. Maybe it was the freshness of it all, or perhaps in some fleeting moment, Daniel truly loved me. But now, I no longer cared to figure it out. A lie is still a lie. No matter how beautifully it's wrapped, its essence remains unchanged. It must have been the relentless overtime these past few days that left me slumped lifelessly in front of my computer. I hadn't even finished the task at hand when my department manager called me into his office for one of his usual lectures. It was nothing more than a stream of harmless criticisms, but as I watched the balding middle-aged man grimace and rant, I couldn't help but recall his sycophantic demeanor in front of Daniel. The contrast was almost comical. I knew exactly what this was about: currying favor with Daniel. The manager's fleshy face contorted dramatically as he pointed a finger at me and launched into a tirade of insults. Before I could process what was happening, a steaming cup of coffee was dumped over my head. The hair I had carefully styled that morning was now drenched with thick, scalding coffee. The hot liquid dripped down my hair, onto my cheeks, and soaked into my clothes. I looked utterly pathetic. The door behind me creaked open, and in walked Daniel, accompanied by the girl from his birthday party. Standing there, drenched in coffee, I felt an overwhelming sense of humiliation. Daniel glanced at me briefly before shifting his gaze to the manager. The once arrogant manager immediately stood up from his chair, bowing and scraping before Daniel. Daniel, ever composed, motioned for the girl behind him to take a seat, and then began discussing work-related matters with the manager. I stood there silently, as though I didn't exist. The office seemed to contain only the three of them. The girl, seemingly unaware of who I was, smiled sweetly at me and pulled a pack of tissues from her bag, handing it to me. I hesitated for a moment but eventually took it. After concluding his conversation with the manager, Daniel turned to me with a warning tone in his voice. "If you're not capable of doing the job, just quit." At that moment, I felt suffocated. He knew full well that all of this had been orchestrated by him, that the manager was acting to please him. The sheer injustice of it all brought tears to my eyes, but for the sake of my pride, I blinked them back. After leaving the office, I gradually calmed down. The hot coffee had jolted me awake. I had to resign. The resignation process was swift. By the next day, I had packed up my belongings and left the company. Having quit 2 jobs within half a year, I decided it was time to take a break, give myself a much-needed vacation, and reset. While I was escaping reality, indulging in hot pot, and shopping with a friend, Daniel appeared. His expression was dark as he spotted the person next to me, his face instantly turning icy. "Who is he?" he demanded. My friend had gone back to the hot pot restaurant to retrieve something she'd left behind, leaving me and her younger brother, Ethan, who had come along to help carry things, waiting outside. Daniel's arrogant tone was grating. I didn't bother answering his question and instead retorted, "What does it matter to you who he is? What are you playing at now?" Daniel's haughty demeanor hadn't changed one bit. "Excuse me, but I don't think she wants to talk to you." Ethan, my friend's younger brother, stepped in, placing himself between us. Tall and composed, he held his ground even against Daniel's oppressive presence. Daniel's temple throbbed visibly as he glared at the younger man standing before him. "I'm her boyfriend." "You have no right to interfere with our conversation," Daniel said coldly. "I've already quit. You're not my boyfriend anymore, and there's nothing I want to discuss with you," I replied, shattering his illusion. Daniel's eyes reddened with fury. Like a lion driven mad, he snarled, "You're still an employee until I approve your resignation." Ethan let out a mocking laugh, looking at him with derision. "Sir, I take it you're not well-versed in labor laws." His words were sharp and dripping with sarcasm. Before Ethan's voice had fully faded, Daniel's fist flew toward him. Ethan barely had time to dodge, and the punch grazed his cheek, leaving a red mark. The impact made it clear that Daniel had put all his strength into it. Ethan, a 20-year-old brimming with youthful pride, instinctively wanted to fight back, but seeing me behind him, he held himself back, covering his face with his hand. "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" I asked, examining the mark on his face. Ethan, still holding his cheek, looked at me with reddened eyes, like a child who had been wronged. Seeing that he wasn't seriously hurt, I was overcome with guilt. My friend had asked her younger brother, who was studying at a university in City Z, to accompany me, and now he had gotten hurt because of me. I turned to Daniel with a mix of blame and anger. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about. We broke up a long time ago. From now on, we're just strangers. If you continue to harass me, I'll report you for stalking." Daniel froze, caught off guard by my words. He glared at Ethan, as if contemplating shoving him aside to grab my hand. But Ethan reacted quickly, blocking him before he could act. Realizing he was at a disadvantage, Daniel softened his tone. "Can't we sit down and talk this through?" he pleaded, his usual arrogance replaced by desperation. But I looked away, my voice cold and distant. There's nothing to talk about. With that, I grabbed Ethan and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, fists clenched tightly as he watched us leave. After the incident, I decided to thank Ethan by treating him to a meal. He accepted gladly. But even then, Daniel couldn't leave me alone. He appeared again, soaked from the rain, his disheveled hair dripping water down his face. He looked like a man abandoned by the world, his eyes filled with hurt. "Emma, I know I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I was just so angry when you left without a word. That's why I acted like that." Even now, he was trying to justify himself. I cut him off, my tone firm. "I'm not interested in your excuses. We're done. I told you before, if you show up again, I'll call the police. So, are you leaving on your own? Or should I make you?" Daniel hesitated, seemingly wanting to say more. "Are you done?" Ethan's voice interrupted. "The meat's ready." He appeared, his hair slightly messy, as if he'd just gotten out of bed, a deliberate move to irritate Daniel. I chose not to expose him. Daniel's face darkened further as he glared at Ethan. "Why is he here?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Why wouldn't I be here? Surely you don't think her ex-boyfriend should be here instead?" The way he emphasized ex-boyfriend made Daniel's expression even uglier. "Emma, you told me you loved me," Daniel said, his voice laced with desperation. For the first time, the situation was beyond his control. His words sounded utterly ridiculous to me. "From the very beginning, it was you who lied to me, dismissed me, and deliberately made me suffer. And now you have the nerve to act like the victim? How convenient." I turned my gaze toward Ethan. Ethan, catching my look, tactfully pretended to have something to do and walked away. Perhaps out of concern, he left me with a parting line. "If you run into trouble, just call me." Now it was just me and Daniel. Seeing Ethan leave, Daniel thought he might still stand a chance. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes. But before he could say anything, I cut him off. "Daniel, don't you think you're pathetic when you question me? Did you ever reflect on yourself? Did you ever think about your own mistakes? From the moment we met, you've been hiding things, lying to me. And when the truth came out, you brushed it off with a flimsy excuse, not even bothering to explain properly. I want to ask you, what exactly is this love you claim to have for me?" Daniel, cornered by my questions, was about to defend himself, but I didn't give him the chance and continued. "Now you're coming back to me, acting as if your love is some grand gesture that'll make me turn back to you? Do you think I'll still orbit around you like I used to, that I can't live without you in my world? How ridiculous, Daniel. Let me make this clear. There's no chance for us anymore. From the moment we reunited, and you dismissed your years of lies with a single careless sentence, we were done." Daniel grabbed my shoulders, his eyes reddened as he stared at me. "Listen to me. I love you. I really do. Just what?" I looked at him coldly, watching his helplessness and disarray. "You just don't love me. You just saw me as a toy to play with, didn't you? Admit it, Daniel. You don't love me. You only love yourself. You're coming back to me now because you can't stand the idea of losing." It was as if I had hit a nerve, like a cat whose tail was stepped on. Daniel panicked. He tried to prove his so-called love for me, spewing a bunch of meaningless words in a desperate attempt to justify himself. I didn't want to waste more time on him and told him to leave. Before he could say anything else, I shut the door in his face and walked back into the room. Lily, my roommate from high school and college, had been there to witness my relationship with Daniel from our university days through our early careers. When she saw me return, her eyes lit up. "So, how did it go?" I was confused and sat down in my chair. "What do you mean, how did it go?" Lily pressed on. "You and Daniel? Oh, we broke up? What else could it be?" Having finally seen Daniel's true colors, I didn't feel the heavy sadness I used to when we broke up. It was more like a burden lifted, a sigh of relief. Lily's excitement grew. "You really broke up? You're not going to soften up and take him back, are you?" Her skeptical look didn't surprise me. After all, when I was with Daniel, my life revolved around him. If I wasn't with him, I was working part-time jobs. Every time we broke up, I'd be the one crawling back begging for reconciliation. Lily used to tease me, calling me hopelessly love-struck. This time, I spoke seriously, assuring Lily that it was truly over with Daniel, no more entanglements. Lily was shocked at first. Then, as if struck by a wild idea, she stared at me with a wolfish grin. Heh 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 heh, she chuckled, looking downright mischievous. Her gaze made me uneasy. I poked at the meat on my plate. What scheme are you cooking up now? Lily looked a bit sheepish, her tone suddenly hesitant. What do you think of my brother, Ethan? I glanced at Ethan, who was sitting nearby, quietly putting meatballs into the hot pot and thoughtfully sharing the cooked meat between our bowls. He looked every bit like a caring domestic type. Handsome, driven, considerate, a great young man. I replied sincerely. Lily's expression turned cautious as she probed further. So, what if you... Realizing where this was going, I quickly interrupted her. Ethan had stepped into the kitchen, and I seized the moment to breathe a sigh of relief. Stop talking nonsense. Lily grinned playfully. I'm just trying to help you heal, you know? Ethan's perfect, good-looking, kind, never been in a relationship, rich, and caring. Enough. I cut her off firmly. We're not a match. Besides, he's too young. I'm not interested in your brother. Seeing how resolute I was, Lily gave up. All right. Such a pity, though. That kid's had a crush on you for years. Her words caught me off guard, and I nearly choked on my water. Him? A crush on me? Of course. Why do you think he used to pick me up from school all the time back in high school? It was just an excuse to see you. I glanced at Ethan, who had just returned from the kitchen, and motioned for Lily to stop talking. And with that, the topic was dropped. After the hot pot, Lily helped me clean up. Then, Lily and I launched into full-on bestie chat mode, while Ethan quietly sat in a corner playing on his phone. By evening, Lily decided to stay the night since it had been ages since we'd had a proper catch-up. Ethan, however, opted to head back to his dorm. When Lily went to shower, I walked Ethan to the door to see him off. As I was about to say goodbye and lock the door, Ethan reached out in his long arm shutting the door with a thud. He leaned against the door, trapping me between him and it. Looking down at me with his clear, intense eyes, the boy who was usually sunny and approachable now exuded an almost predatory air. I'm not a kid anymore, I'm an adult now. His ears were red as he spoke, his gaze unwavering and filled with determination. Lily's words about Ethan's longtime crush on me echoed in my head. Faced with his earnestness, I was at a loss for words. I admit, for a moment, I was spellbound. Before I could respond, Ethan straightened up, as if afraid to hear a rejection. See you tomorrow, he said hastily before turning and leaving in a flustered rush. After that near confession, Ethan seemed to find every opportunity to strike up a conversation or orchestrate accidental encounters. I lost count of how many times this month I'd seen him following me. Today I rubbed my temples as I looked at his puppy dog face. Don't you have classes to attend? Why are you following me around every day? Ethan widened his clear eyes innocently. Didn't you know? It's break time. I smacked my forehead, realizing I'd been working so long, I'd completely forgotten students even had holidays. As someone who had watched Ethan grow up, I couldn't bring myself to outright reject him. Instead, I gently suggested he spend his break doing something meaningful to enrich his life. The subtext was clear. Stop following me. Perhaps it was the wounds from my last relationship, but I wasn't ready to jump into something new. Emotional recovery doesn't happen overnight. Besides, Ethan was my best friend's younger brother, a boy I'd seen grow up. Hurting him wasn't something I wanted to do, but Ethan acted like he didn't understand my hints, playing dumb. When I mentioned it to Lily, hoping she might talk some sense into her brother, she surprised me by brushing it off entirely. Instead, she started gossiping about me and Ethan, clearly enjoying the drama. At the start of the school semester, just when I thought Ethan would finally settle down after returning to campus, he went ahead and rented an apartment directly across from mine. When I opened the door and saw Ethan standing opposite me, he greeted me with a grin. What a coincidence, he said. Was it really just a coincidence? In truth, Ethan was like an overly clingy presence that I simply couldn't shake off. There were times when I'd had enough and firmly expressed my rejection to him. But Ethan was like an indestructible cockroach. Just when I was at my wits' end, he'd take a thoughtful step back. Then, slowly but surely, he'd inch closer again. This cycle repeated endlessly, leaving me both exasperated and helpless. The only upside to Ethan moving in across from me was gaining access to a top-notch chef whose meals I could conveniently borrow. Given my subpar cooking skills and the fact that Daniel was no better in the kitchen, we often just made do with each other's lackluster attempts at meals. But Ethan's cooking? I strongly suspected he had trained at a professional culinary school. Every time I vowed not to impose on his cooking anymore, the delicious aroma wafting from his apartment next door would weaken my resolve, and I'd find myself wandering over again. In this peculiar neighborly relationship built on shared meals, Ethan and I grew closer. As time went on, the wounds from my relationship with Daniel slowly healed, leaving only faint scars. I found myself thinking about the past less and less. I sent out resumes, secured a new job, and started focusing on building my own life again. Once I started working, Ethan would wait for me to get off work every day. Over time, this evolved into him picking me up after work. At first, I told him not to bother, but he insisted. And so, our relationship settled into this strange in-between stage. More than friendship, but not quite lovers. Ethan never pushed for more. Apart from being incredibly good to me, he held back, afraid of putting too much pressure on me. Everything changed one evening on my way home from work. I ran into a drunken thug who started harassing me. Before I could react, Ethan appeared and, seeing what was happening, punched the man several times without hesitation. It wasn't until the police arrived to mediate that the situation finally ended. Ethan walked away from the fight with a gash on his face from the scuffle. As I treated his wound, he sat there quietly, staring at me intently. When I moved my hand away, Ethan grabbed it. His voice was steady yet gentle as he confessed his feelings to me. He said he was terrified of what might happen if he failed to protect me. I couldn't deny it. I was moved. So, I said yes. Ethan wrapped me in his arms, grinning like a giddy fool, as if he were the spoiled son of a wealthy family who had just gotten his way. I saw Daniel again at a class reunion. The once dashing man who had always cared about appearances now seemed utterly defeated. He sat alone on the couch, drinking excessively, a shadow of his former self. A few old classmates mentioned that his family's company was on a steep decline, and Daniel had lost all motivation. His family had already begun grooming a new heir. After the reunion ended, I waited at the door for Ethan to pick me up. Daniel, reeking of alcohol, approached me. Just as he opened his mouth to say something, Ethan's car pulled up. Daniel froze, his expression filled with sadness, as he asked, "Are you with him now?" I got into the passenger seat of Ethan's car and glanced at Daniel, who was standing by the road. Speaking in the tone of someone addressing an old friend, I said, "The past is in the past. What's meant to be, let go should be let go. I wish you happiness moving forward." Ethan leaned over to buckle my seatbelt before starting the car. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Daniel cover his face, crouching down like a helpless child, sobbing in regret. But unfortunately, there's no remedy for regret in this world.